From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City. October 19th is the annual Freedom to Read Day of Action organized by the Coalition United Against Book Bans and co-sponsored by a number of educational, civic, and religious groups, including Interfaith Alliance. This week, I'll be speaking with Dartmouth Associate Dean of Libraries for Collections and Content Strategies, Qiana Johnson, who was the spark that got the Episcopal Church to make a resolution condemning censorship. Essential to that achievement was the Union of Black Episcopalians, and I'll be joined by the leader of that group, the Very Reverend Kim Coleman. And later, Rabba Rori Picker Neiss, Senior Vice President for Community Relations at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, where she works to bring diverse communities together to stand against censorship, book bans, and efforts to target and erase vulnerable populations, including transgender youth. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can also visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. That way you'll never miss an episode, and you'll also have access to over 100 past interviews with guests like Dr. Anthea Butler, Jeff Charlotte, Bishop William Barber, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Dr. Jamar Tisby, Rob Reiner, and many, many others. And help spread the word about the State of Belief. Tell the people in your networks about what you're hearing and subscribe today. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get started, here's something I want to get on your radar. Interfaith Alliance's first ever Achieving Democracy Together bus tour, rolling out October 28th in Omaha, Nebraska, with stops in Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. I will be there and the entire Interfaith Alliance team, and we will be showing up with local religious communities to help get out the vote and rally to protect the election and our democracy. I also want to raise up the other important national bus tours happening now or starting soon. Of course, the Nuns on the Bus and Friends tour, but also the Faith and Democracy tour, the Vote Common Good tour, and the Revolutionary Love tour. We'll link to all of these from stateofbelief.com. And now to my first guest, Qiana Johnson, Associate Dean of Libraries for Collections and Content Strategies at Dartmouth. She has firsthand knowledge of the impact book bans and censorship can have on the public's right to read, with a long history of work as a librarian. She's also the spark, the human spark, that got the Episcopal Church to make a resolution condemning censorship. Qiana, welcome to the State of Belief.
Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe you can just talk a little bit about, to start with, your own history. Like, tell me, what was the decision to become a librarian?
It was a circuitous route that did not need to be as circuitous as it was. I did my undergraduate. I was a pre-med English major. I thought I was going to be a doctor, and realized that wasn't my path, and tried a number of different things. And then I remembered, as a 4-year-old, my grandmother taking me to the library and loving it, and telling her at 4 years old, you know what, when I grow up, I'm going to be a librarian. And realized I should have just listened to 4-year-old me, because she was much smarter than 20-something-year-old me. And I got back to where I wanted to be. It's where I spent all of my childhood. My grandmother would take me to the library every week. I would be amazed at all the books that I had access to. I had my own card, and I was able to check things out. And that continued on through elementary school. My very first non-paid job was a shelver in my elementary school library, and I got the job because I could read books while pretending to shelve. I didn't shelve nearly as much as I should have, because I was too busy reading. And then on through high school I was a little nerdy, and the cafeteria was a hard place to be. So I spent my lunch hour in the library. So I really should have seen all the signs, and I just ignored them for way too long.
When was the first time you became aware of this censorship that was really gaining traction in American life.
So I'm really active with the American Library Association, and I was on a committee, and just through committee conversations, folks were talking about, oh, there's been an increase in the number of book challenges I'm seeing in my community. I'm also seeing this in my community. And it was one of those things of it just felt odd because you'd hear folks wanting to ban Harry Potter, and it was the, oh, okay, book challenges were always happening, but it was just kind of it's a one-off sort of thing. We have systems and structures to talk to our communities about the materials that they might want to have a conversation with. But it became wholesale, like it was just an onslaught of these. And I think that that's part of what was intending to happen, is that the system is overwhelmed. When you have one book challenge or two book challenges, you can navigate that. When it becomes 100, you're frozen. Like there is a difficulty in even contemplating, how do I address this? Where do I go for help? What systems are available for me to be able to navigate this?
Was this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or more?
I think probably around 2020 is when it
Okay.
markedly increased. And from that 2020, just year over year, the market increase of 160% year over year of the number of book challenges.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think that tracks. I probably became aware of it around 2022. But I went down to Southwest Florida to speak, and when I got down there, the lead story was like 400 books pulled from shelves. How is that not shocking to people? It's also true that there's like almost a personal attack on librarians. It's not like, let's have a discussion about what kind, these are not done in the way of, we want a serious conversation about making sure that we have access or that we have concerns. All of a sudden, people were using terms like groomer, terrible terms about librarians. I mean, those are terrible terms to be directed at anybody, but like that somehow librarians were nefarious. We're trying to do something to it's always the children, do something to the children. And these are librarians who spent their whole life trying to make information accessible to you, with like people like you, Qiana, when you were 4. I mean, that's where this also feels a little bit different.
Because it becomes personal attack. And particularly if you're working in a community, you're part of that community, people see you at the grocery store, you are suddenly othered in your community. You're the person who's introducing this nefarious content to corrupt our children. And the issue is invariably the voices who are making the most noise aren't necessarily the majority voices, but the majority voices
Always.
are quiet, and you're not
Right.
supported. You feel that your community has just turned you loose to folks who don't support you, and that you're being attacked, and that there's no one who believes in the work that you're doing and the value that you're bringing to your community.
Librarians feel in the moment of attack, they don't feel necessarily like they know if the majority is with them. This is happening, and it's happening in your community. It's happening in Manhattan. This is not something that's in a far-off land. This is happening all over America. Here's the ugly truth about a lot of this, that a lot of book bans and a lot of attacks on librarians are done under the cover of religion, of using religion, weaponizing religion to say, oh, well, I'm protecting my children because these people are trying to, whatever, and it's against my religion. And therefore, my religion gets to trump everybody else's religion and everybody else's needs. Because of my narrow religion, I get to raise up and have this righteous flag. And many of us who are religious and who are from diverse religious communities, we've been a little bit flat-footed in this and not recognized what was going on. But I think we're waking up. And one of the reasons and one of the great things I want to celebrate today is librarian Qiana Johnson, who actually said, you know what? I have feet in a few different communities, and you have rallied your religious community to really show up in this way. So maybe you can tell us that story about how you began to imagine your religious community joining in this fight.
And it's one of those things where, as a librarian, seeing the book challenges, like professionally, I was frustrated by it and trying to work within my profession for how do I support my fellow librarians through this. But then the conversation of, well, I'm doing this as a part of my faith community, that this is against my religious beliefs. And that's when I, to be perfectly frank, got a little furious. This is not the faith that I hold. This is not the faith that many people hold. We value the diversity of our communities. We value the rich diversity that we have and that we should highlight. And so it was one of these moments of I can do the work with my librarian colleagues, but I also needed the faith communities to know that, hey, things are happening under your name, and are you comfortable with this? And
Mm,
part of it was just letting people know that this was happening, because when you're a librarian, you're immersed in this. This is sadly your everyday, so I can't not know it. But there are many people who, for very valid reasons, didn't know it, and so it was the figuring out who I could talk to raise this. And I'm an Episcopalian and I hang out in Episcopalian spaces. And so I would just mention this in passing to folks, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's really unfortunate, but that's not really a church thing." And I'm like, parts of the human story are being weaponized, and parts of the human story are being denigrated, and parts of that human story and our beauty is being hidden, and part of the community is being told that they aren't truly part of the community, that they are dangerous parts of the community, and that is a church issue. And so figuring out kind of how do I get other people in my community to care about that? How do I get people to understand that stories are sacred, and
mm.
hearing other people's stories, our entire faith community is based on stories. Not all of them are fun. Not all of them are shiny and happy. We learn from things that are sometimes challenging, but we have to do that.
This is, for me, of course, working at Interfaith Alliance and working with religion and democracy, this is a religious freedom issue as salient as any religious freedom issue out there. Because what book bannings do is they restrict what is allowed to be part of the beautiful, large, and expanding canon of what stories matter. And that includes sacred stories. As you say, some sacred stories are uncomfortable and they're not like all super sweet. And we're going to ban those because they don't make us feel warm and fuzzy. Keep going with that story. What was the mechanism by which you decided, okay, this is the avenue I'm going to take?
Again, I'm a librarian. It's where I have to work. And so within the library sphere, there's Unite Against Book Bans, which is kind of a grassroots advocacy organization to help, number one, raise people's awareness that this is happening in their community, and give people the tools and mechanisms for how to work against that. And folks can sign on as individuals, but organizations can also sign on. And I was like, okay, let me send a letter to the Union of Black Episcopalians to say, hey, this book bans and challenges are happening. And the other pernicious part of these book challenges is that 47% of them are for materials that are by and about the LGBTQ community and the BIPOC community. That's a problem. That it's a very targeted whose stories are being weaponized and whose stories are being restricted.
Right.
And so I wrote a letter, and it's one of these moments of kind of use the tools that you have at Access. As I mentioned, I'm an Episcopalian, so I was able to say, as an Episcopalian, this is why I think this is an important issue. Also, titles are sometimes handy. In addition to being a librarian, I'm also an ordained deacon in the Episcopal Church, so I can put a reverend in front of my name. And so, where that's helpful, bring out those titles. And so, sending that letter and just letting people know that this is a thing that's happening in all of our communities, and that there's a way that they can become active and learn a little bit more. And they agreed with that and signed on to be an organizational partner for Unite Against Book Bans. Becoming an organizational member was an opportunity for me to come and meet with their board to talk about this, to provide the terrifying numbers of the amount of book challenges and the increase in the amount of materials that people are trying to restrict. And then again, the content of what those materials are, whose stories people are trying to restrict. And kind of once there is that level setting of oh, this is a thing that's happening, let's do something about it. Book challenges are frequently happening in local communities. And so how do we show up for our local communities? How do we show up for our local libraries? But again, there is always that nagging question of, is this a church issue? And is this the place where the church should have a voice and should stand up? And so
the people who are not asking that, they're not wondering if this is an appropriate way for the church. Are the people who are levying the book bans. They're like, oh, yeah. They're they're like, we're going to, even though they have no sanction, they want to use religion any way they can in brute power, weaponizing faith. And so it's very frustrating that this long thought process has to be like, is this a church issue? That's not something that the people who are trying to ban books are thinking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's one of those I'm a librarian. I like to educate folks. And so it's the part of the education is letting people know that this is an issue. And in addition to knowing that's an issue, then to talk about why it is a church issue. There's a frequent conversation about becoming beloved community, about being inclusive and recognizing the diversity of creation and all of us in it. When parts of our community are excluded, that's a faith issue that we can have conversations and they can be challenging, but we should not be actively trying to exclude parts of the whole.
I love that you're referencing the beloved community. That's like such a, it's, I think this goes back to Howard Thurman, perhaps, or, maybe certainly Dr. King used that language of what it means to be part of the beloved community, which is one way of thinking about Jesus talking about the kingdom of God on earth as in heaven. And what does it mean to really fulfill that mandate in a way that really is inclusive and that everyone is part of that beloved community, which it's just a very heartful goal.
Yeah. And so with that, figuring out a way that I could get this to the larger church and elevate this to them. And so timing being a beautiful thing, the General Convention was coming up, which is every 3-year governing body for the Episcopal Church, where various policies are set, resolutions about particular issues are put forward. And so I'm like, could we write a resolution about opposing censorship and opposing book challenges? And so with that meeting, that opening meeting I had with the Union of Black Episcopalians, floating the idea of, is there a possibility for writing a resolution? And so as folks were doing the rest of their businessy meetings, I'm in my hotel, on my laptop writing things up. Folks really took to it. I think folks really understood that this is a problem in our communities, that we need our church to stand up and say that we value inclusivity, we value stories, we want people to be able to see themselves in their community. The thing about materials in libraries is that it allows young people in particular to see themselves. Invariably, you always get the books about dogs and cats and lovely animals, and people from a majority community. Where are the stories of little Black girls who do science? Those books didn't exist when I was a kid. I was really good at science. According to the books in my library, I didn't exist. And so there's the importance of young people being able to see themselves in their community. And young people they're very wise, and they hear these conversations, and they also notice what stories are being challenged, what communities are considered too dangerous, whose stories are being restricted. And it impacts their sense of self. What's wrong with me?
Right. I think about, my kids who have 2 dads, and they don't need you to talk about it all the time. But occasionally coming across a story where that is normalized. And again, no one's trying to promote this. It's just like, oh, that's my story. Okay, great. I've read a story about me. I'm I'm part of this broader conversation. That is not subverting anyone else's experience. It just is recognizing lots of different people are coming together in school settings. And isn't it great if everybody has a sense that, oh yeah, I belong here. The stories matter. I just think it's so important. And again, it's so frustrating to me that some people are so upset about that they want to take away those stories. I mean, it really is. It's a tragedy. The good part of your story so far, and I want to get to the punchline, is that when you introduce this first to your Black Episcopalian group, they lots of iterations of resolutions, but eventually you got there, and then you brought it to the General Convention, and so expanded the story, and people. Once you raised it, they were like, aha, oh, I see why this is a church issue. We started with is this a church issue? And then it sounds like, and I want you to keep going, that people really were like, I get this completely, why this is a church issue.
And I think it was just even having the conversation in a church space,
right.
It helps people to talk about it, that it's not that separation of the secular life and the religious life. Those frequently blend together and bleed into each other. And so having this air quotes secular conversation in a church space gives people the permission to think about it as a church issue, that if we want to create the kingdom of God here on earth, what do we have to do that? Do we have to work within the systems we have? And that means, school boards and things like this. If I want a diverse, inclusive community, how do I make that happen? And what are the things that I need to advocate? Sometimes against, I don't like book bans. So
Yeah.
how do I talk about that in my secular community with the understanding that I'm coming at this from a faith base, that this is not just a intellectual librarian issue of why I'm opposed to book bans. This is a faith-based reason that I am opposed to book bans, because it's not inclusive to the entirety of my community. At the end of the day, it was supported by the House of Deputies and supported by the House of Bishops, which means that it was approved by the General Council. So it's in the resolutions, it's an approved resolutions. It's part of the General Convention of, 2024.
The congratulations. And I think it's exactly what I'm hoping will happen more and more. We can kind of raise awareness among faith communities. This is something that you should be thinking about in terms of religious freedom, in terms of your own community commitments. And, we were very glad to partner with the United Against Book Bans on something called Ban Books, Ban Beliefs, which you can also find both on United Against Book Bans website as well as the Interfaith Alliance website. So this is a movement. Once we really wake up, and I know that there are Jewish folks working on this, Muslim, there are people all over across the religious spectrum who are beginning to recognize the threat of book bans. And so this is it's such a good moment, and I just really appreciate all the work that you did.
Thanks. And if there's something I can highlight about the resolution itself, with that conversation about, is this a church issue? Does the church have a leg to stand on here? Yes, there's the part of the resolution that urges the church to work and to advocate for the inclusion of materials in schools and libraries, but there's also the call to itself. And so part of that resolution is it's calling church libraries to include the stories of LGBTQ and BIPOC Christians, the recognition that we need to work on this internally amongst ourselves as well, and to make sure that to curate and preserve those stories as well.
Well, honestly, sometimes church libraries feel like, oh, look at that musty room that no one really is paying attention to. But more and more, and this is Episcopal churches, but also I have friends in all kinds of other churches where it's like, they're having banned book breakfasts within the church. It's and they're saying, okay, if these are being forced off the shelves in local libraries, we're gonna stock them. It doesn't mean we're not going to do advocacy out in the community, but we are going to recognize these are valuable to us, and we want to make them accessible to people. I mean, it's wow, talk about a good way to get folks. If it's a type of evangelism, it's saying, hey, this is the kind of community where all are welcome, where the beloved community is being being actualized today, including all the stories. I mean, it's, I love that there's like internal work as well. And it's great,
Yeah.
frankly, for authors. I mean, they are also targets in all of this. Black authors, LGBTQ authors. One of the findings, among religious books, those that center Muslim characters, those that center Jewish characters are often targeted. So this has another element. So there's authors who are also being targeted here and buying books by them, putting them in your show. It's just it's a great action. So I do want to turn to Freedom to Read Day of Action. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and why we should all be celebrating it and doing something on it?
It's an opportunity for communities to host events, but also if there's not an event in your community, it's an opportunity for us as individuals to take a few moments to learn about what we as an individual can do in our community to support the freedom to read, to support the continued access to information. And so there are talking points that you can learn about, ways that you can interact with our elected officials, but also ways that we can talk to our neighbors. Again, what people don't know is what they don't know, but if we can have conversations about why something is important and why it's important to us as an individual and why we think it's important to our community, it gives us the language that we might not have access to. Again, I'm a librarian. I do this all the time. I don't expect other people to have that language. And so this day of action gives us collectively that language that we can use to talk about how we want to make sure that there's that continued freedom of access to information and freedom of access to books.
What's the URL that people can go to in order to find out more?
It's uniteagainstbookbans.org/day-of-action.
Does this affect you at all at Dartmouth? I mean, no one's coming for you at Dartmouth, are they? Or are you getting questions where it's like, well, why are you featuring this material versus that material? I mean, I think that even in, the hallowed halls of academy, people probably have are challenging what kind of information is available.
Yeah, and it's in my, ivory tower. It's not happening now, but it's one of those things of if we're not careful, it will,
Yep.
because these book challenges started in just school libraries. Then they expanded to public libraries. Then there's a conversation about restricting access in bookstores. So again, I could very safely say this is not a academic library problem. I'm going to just let the school librarians deal with it. Number one,
Right.
that's a selfish thing to say, but number two, it's going to get to me eventually if I'm not
Right.
careful. And so again, I'm part of a community, whether that's an academic community, a library community, just a New Hampshire community. It is our collective responsibility to make sure that everyone has access to the information they need to become who they are intended to be in this world. They need to have access to that information. And the
Right.
other thing is a lot of times folks are like, well, the books that are being challenged are about marginalized communities. I'm not part of a marginalized community. This doesn't really affect me. But again, it's one of those opportunities of air quotes safe space for people to learn about other communities and in a way that's easy. Depending on where you live in this country, there may not be people who don't look like you. And so how do you learn about other people? You don't have the chance to interact with them at the grocery store, you don't meet them at church. Books are a wonderful place to be able to do that, but you have to
Mm.
have access to the book to be able to learn about others. And it's one of those things of, yes, we all are on different parts of our journey. And at certain points, some things just are, we're not there yet. But that doesn't mean it should be restricted for everyone else.
Mm.
Sometimes people are like, oh, this is too mature for my ninth grade student to be in the high school library. It's like, well, there's seniors there as well. And also, you
Right.
don't know that individual student's lived experience. You don't
Right.
know what they are wanting to work through by themselves with a book, and having that access and also trusting people to know when something might not be for them. They may take it off the shelf, they may start and they're like, I'm this is past me right now, or I can't.
Right.
I'm not able to engage, and I'm going to put it back. I
Right.
mentioned
And I
earlier that
think
I
like
was.
and one of the great things about librarians is that they're so sensitive to that idea, to that conversation. That's part of their training. It's not like
Mhm.
they're like, read this book, or
It's like
else,
sometimes you're just not there, and that is
yeah,
absolutely
then that,
okay.
yeah, right. Listen, Reverend Qiana, I think I introduced you without adding the Reverend before. But now
And that's okay because it's a stealth reverend. Again,
it's
I
a
only use it
stealth
when
Reverend, but
necessary.
not on this show. You are definitely Reverend. You're a hero. You're a total hero, and I don't mean that in an inflating way. I just mean that in a very clear, taking the steps that are needed way. And I'm just so grateful for your work and your testimony. We like to end this show by asking people what gives them hope. And I'm Reverend Qiana Johnson. What gives you hope?
That people care deeply, that that people care deeply enough to want to change the world, and that they're willing to have conversations, and they're willing to have hard conversations, and if we extend each other enough grace and compassion to have those conversations, I think we can ultimately create the world we want to see. And I'm I have hope with the people who are willing to wade into the messiness and the hardness to be able to do that. That, yeah, it's not all sunshine and lollipops. It is hard, but the folks who are willing to do that hard work give me hope.
Reverend Qiana Johnson, thank you so much for joining us on The State of Belief.
Thank you so much for having me.
Up next, the very Reverend Kim Coleman, president of the Union of Black Episcopalians. And later, Rabba Rori Picker Neiss, Senior Vice President for Community Relations at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, will talk to us about their work in combating censorship. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You can also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
This week on Complexified, school vouchers for religious education. Who wins, who loses?
The state of Oklahoma tried to create the first ever virtual Catholic school.
And that's a charter school in Oklahoma.
So that's been appealed to the Supreme Court. And as somebody who follows the Supreme Court even more closely than I do baseball, I'd be surprised if they take it. That's establishing a faith-based school with public dollars.
Check out Complexified wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. The very Reverend Kim Coleman, president of the Union of Black Episcopalians, which led the charge to raise the issue of book bans and censorship to the denominational level within the Episcopal Church. She's also rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Arlington, Virginia. Reverend Kim, welcome to The State of Belief.
Thank you so much, Reverend Paul. It's just a delight to be here with you. Just another opportunity for us to allow a broader audience to be aware of important issues, not only that UBE is addressing, but other organizations such as yourself.
Isn't that wonderful? Thank you so much for being with us. So let me go back. And what was the first time that you began to be aware of book bans as something that was happening across the country, and how that made you feel, as an American, but then also as a priest and as someone who represents, in some ways, you could say, the word. Take me back to the first time you began to be like, wait, what's going on around here?
And so this whole question about book bans has been bubbling up in various communities for a while. But where it really hit home for me and members of the Union of Black Episcopalians was at a conference that we had down in Montgomery, Alabama, 2 years ago now. And one of the visiting bishops from the UK, as part of her blessing that she offered at the end of the service, came forward and said that her sister's book, That's Not My Story, had been banned. And suddenly, what we had experienced from a distance came home, because our whole topic was on, anti-racism and being able to build up the community of people who are often disenfranchised, Blacks, LGBTQ plus, Latinos, Asian, Pacific. That's our whole conversation at our conference. So when she ended it by talking a specific example of a great book, by the way, that was banned without having been read by the person who initiated the banning process, then I knew then. Suddenly, I looked at my email, and there's this email from the Reverend Deacon Qiana Johnson.
Isn't that amazing? That feels meant to be. That is such an important story that you mentioned. Because, that's the thing. This is connected to other things. This is not just about banning books. It's about banning stories. It's about erasing history. It's about deciding what counts, what matters. And for people of faith, that's a very dangerous road to go down, because you start erasing stories. And we're all about stories. I mean, if you talk about the Christian faith, but any faith, Hindus, all of it is rooted in stories. And if someone decides this is a story that cannot be shared, and I'm going to side that for everybody, now that is a direct assault on faithful people.
Absolutely.
And as especially, I think, when you bring that together with, for instance, in your case, the Black Episcopalians, it's about erasing Black history. And it's about erasing a really important part of American history that we need to talk about. We need actually more stories about it, not less stories.
It's so very, very true. I mean, just the reality that suddenly we've got these interests that want to remove and erase part of the story that we worked so hard to unfold the richness of who we are as a nation and the fullness of the experience, and also to recognize that worldwide. The Episcopal Church for the last 9 years, with the presiding Bishop Michael Curry, whose tenure ends on November the 1st. But anyway, with him, we've been talking about beloved community, establishing beloved community, and recognizing that part of that process is getting the full story.
Beloved and community. You can't love someone and erase them at the same time. This is just so important. So you get this email from the Reverend Deacon Qiana, and this happens just as you've had this experience in Montgomery. Yeah. And doesn't that feel like divine providence? I hate to
It felt that way to me. That's why we acted so quickly upon it.
I'm sure that both with your kind of civic hat on, but then also as a priest and as someone who cares for a community, you saw this as an opportunity to show up in a particular way on this issue that intersects with so many other issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. A little bit of background into the Union of Black Episcopalians, because for 56 years, we've been that voice within the Episcopal Church that has been urging us forward to be a more inclusive, anti-racist, embracing of all people, organization and entity, if not body. So that's been our work. And we've discovered that we are more effective when we are united, as opposed to being individuals trying to achieve the same outcomes. So for 56 years, we've learned how to work through the systems of the church, which include from the local congregation up to the diocesan level, up to our every 3-year general convention, where the resolutions are passed that then become the agenda for the church for the next 3 years. And
Isn't that
before we
amazing?
can get everybody from the local to the diocese to the whole Episcopal Church to give attention to the issue of banning books, We had to be able to get a resolution before a general convention and get that resolution approved so it could be worked into the fiber of the Episcopal Church that we condemn censorship. That's the
Mm,
language that the actual resolution used. We condemn censorship.
mm.
And so now we're empowered. The Union of Black Episcopalians is not a church. It is an
Right.
independent nonprofit. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
sometimes it's able to identify for the church because its members are actively involved in every level of
Mm.
Episcopal church polity. So we're able to identify issues, much like deacons do, identify issues in the world that need to be brought back to the church so that the church is then equipped and empowered to take action. So
Right.
we have this very unique position when it comes to our relationship to the Episcopal Church. So there was no struggle for us. We saw
Uh-huh.
immediately the justice issues there. We saw the, I'll call it abuse that our
Mm.
librarians and our library systems were going through because they were being overwhelmed by
Right.
requests that they couldn't respond to, and rather than be worn down, they would often have to just take a position that was not one that they wanted to take, which was grant the ban. What happened is after Qiana and I became in agreement, I had to take it back to the UBE board of directors and say, look, would we like to, number one, become a member of, Unite Against Book
Right.
Bans? And number two, what about doing a resolution? And so we had to work it through the system
Right.
because there are people that are dedicated to writing such things.
Uh-huh.
The Black deputies of the General Convention and leadership. We have a gentleman by the name of Joe McDaniels who has worked for many years to help facilitate the process of getting these important issues before General Convention. And so after Qiana did a beautiful job of drafting a resolution that gave us both the history of the issue as well as the power action points. Then we had to take it back to our membership, two gatherings. They said stamp of approval. And then we worked through Mr. Joe McDaniels in order to get the resolution put on the calendar for General Convention into the committee. It
Yeah.
goes to a committee. The committee has to review it and approve it. The committee looked at it and said, this is great, but it's not strong enough. Now, like, okay. And they did
Oh.
their work. And they said it was not strong enough. And so they came back with some precise, direct language that
Wow.
called upon the church to take certain actions and certain posture in response to bans.
Mm.
And it went
Mm.
before then the floor of the House of Deputies. And then, of course, it has to be agreed to in what we call the House of Bishops. And therefore, it became approved and part of our agenda for the Episcopal Church.
I think this is really important, and it's something that, I and Interfaith Alliance and all across the country have been really shouting is that this is actually a religious issue. This is, this is about affecting our communities. And we have to say it also plainly that a lot of this is because of people using religion as an excuse to ban books, saying, "Oh, well, this violates my understanding of faith, and it makes me uncomfortable." It's very hard, I think, if you're a librarian and someone comes at you and says, "This is a faith issue. You're attacking my faith by having these books on here." It's very hard for them, unless other people of faith say, "I'm going to step up."
Right. Yes.
And I'm gonna and no, you don't speak for religion in this battle. You do not have the religious mantle. You can't say that you represent the religious community because actually many, 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 many more religious folks disagree with you.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I celebrate and I invite all librarians, especially those coming under assault, to join the Episcopal Church because our baptismal vows that we take and repeat often over the course of the year is that we vow to respect the dignity of every human being. There's no ifs, ands, or buts there. It's of every human being. Okay? And so when you've got that written into the core foundational documents, and you're willing to fight for those core foundational documents and stand by them, right? We have our disagreements too, but we've got a starting point that is sound. And from that, we're able to celebrate all people and believe in God's gospel, Jesus' gospel of love. I mean, we can do these things because of that foundation. It helps us a lot.
Well, I love, Reverend Coleman, that you use this opportunity to invite and do a little evangelizing. You can. I will say for the record that my partner and my husband and I we attend Episcopal Church, and our two boys are baptized in the Episcopal Church. I'm radically ecumenical, I will say, in my outlook, but we have found actually the Episcopal Church stands by what it says, and so it's been a comfortable place for us in this moment.
I celebrate all faiths, and that's part of that's a core tenet too.
Yeah, right.
That you have an openness and an acceptance and a love for all people.
What are the tangible ways you would like a local church, a local Episcopal church, to live out this resolution?
Mm-hmm. So for me, this is particularly the place where people stumble because we do not like to admit that Jesus was involved with politics. And we sometimes like to think that politics are off the agenda for people of faith. Because my first action at the local level is, number one, find out who is on your school board. Number two, run for election to your school board. Number three, look at it's all deeply rooted in that hard fought and won privilege of all people, couple categories exception, but of all people to vote, right? Because that's where the more we have representation on these decision-making bodies, the easier it is for the voice to be heard. And sometimes all it takes is one voice. I mean, people think you got to have an army. No. There's so infinite number of stories where it takes just one steadfast voice to penetrate some systems, some thought systems.
Yeah.
About what is, and one clear story. Be willing to tell your story. If reading is a value to you, and reading all types of materials, right? If you've learned and grown for that, if you're a parent and you're making those choices for your children, because that's also part of it, let each parent make their own choice for what their child should get, but don't deny anybody else. So you ask me, what do I want to see happen at that local level? We spend a lot of time on great big national elections like what we're having coming up on November the 5th. But so often we kind of ignore or put of a lower value those that are electing local officials. That's our first step.
One thing I just learned is that many libraries actually have community boards that are elected positions. And that was actually news to me. Like, I have to say, I didn't pay that much attention to school board issues in New York City. I live in New York City, and I was kind of like, I'm sure it'll be fine. And then, my school board that includes the Greenwich Village, which is where Stonewall happened, passed an anti-trans resolution because we weren't paying attention. And, it was just like, all of a sudden, it was like, wait a second, who is on our school board? And how did this happen? I'd love to invite also, like, the idea that if you're a local religious leader, get to know your library, get to know your librarian. Let them know that, hey, if anything, I'm here for you. I'm very interested in what's going on. It's really easy to walk into a library and say, hey, I'm wearing a collar, or I'm a deacon, or whatever, and we just want to let you know that we're here for you. If a book ban is happening, like, let us know. I'm talking to libraries at the same time, saying, reach out to local Episcopal church, reach out to your local synagogue, your mosque, and say, hey, we want to have an advisory group to help us make sure that we're able, and in that way you create a base of power that can say, no, we're not gonna succumb to all of these book bans.
So true. People of faith are called to be proactive, not reactive.
Mm.
The beginning of the Christian tradition, Jesus Christ told us to go and make disciples. That means get up and go. So we have a custom of waiting till something tragic happens before we awaken, right? And then we're on it, but a bit too late, right?
Yeah.
So how do we
Proactive rather than reactive. I think this is what happened here is that they got activated and they got motivated and they went on the attack. And a little bit we were on the defensive. We don't have to be on the defensive anymore. We know what's happening. And so I just really appreciate what you have been a part of, and also the broader Union of Black Episcopalians. It just sounds like such an important group that is raising awareness at the intersection of issues that affecting society and the church and the broader faith community. So wonderful. I want to end this interview with the question I ask everyone, which is, Reverend Kim Coleman, what gives you hope in these days?
Our young people give me hope. They are not laden with some of the issues and concerns. As a matter of fact, that's what has kept them a little bit disconnected from I'm going to say, the older generation systems of operations, because what we think is such a big issue is not an issue for them. And I take delight every time I see a young person who and support. And most people know me. If you want me to get me to do something that I might not be inclined to do, send a young person to ask, right? Because they are now our future, and they're carving out, the young voice, the concern for creation care, the concern for peace. I mean, even the concerns over, the upcoming election, all of that. The young people, they give me hope and they give me joy, you know. So that's
I
that's
love
my
that.
answer to that. Mm-hmm.
The Very Reverend Kim Coleman is president of the Union of Black Episcopalians, which took the lead in the entire denomination passing a resolution against book bans. Reverend Kim, thank you so much for being with us today on The State of Belief.
It has been my pleasure, Paul, and I look forward to another opportunity in the future when we can collaborate together to share what I believe is the good news of the Jesus gospel, right? The gospel of love for all. Thank you, Paul.
Amen. Rabba Rori Picker Neiss is a faith leader, an activist, and senior vice president for community relations at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She's also a parent and knows firsthand the devastating effects that censorship and book bans can have, particularly on vulnerable populations that often get erased in the process. And so I'm grateful to have Rori back with us today on The State of Belief. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So talk to me about how the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is a major national organization that works on important issues that affect the Jewish community, but also the wider community. How did book bans and censorship become part of what you felt was really important to speak out against and actually get active in working to oppose?
One of the major areas that JCPA is working on is the intersection of combating hate and defending democracy, knowing that the only way that any of us are safe are when all of us are safe, and that the ways in which hatred against any community is being spread ultimately undermines our democratic processes, and the undermining of our democratic processes leads to more hatred and more vulnerability of communities. And we can see that maybe most clearly with book bans and censorship. The ways in which the core of any democratic society is education. And anytime there's efforts to erase any story or any community, that inherently makes that community more in danger. We can talk about that from the Jewish community perspective, but it's true of every community. And the efforts right now, particularly to ban books in libraries and in schools, are being done in the name of protecting our children. And yet we're seeing again and again that the books that are being pulled from shelves, it's not about not being age appropriate. They're specifically books that are being written by people of color. They're books that are being written by and represent families that are that are queer, whether it's families that have two dads, families that have somebody who's trans, any books that are talking about these identities that right now are under attack in our society at large.
Right. 100%. I love the way you talked about that. And working against hate and protecting our democracy. Those are two things that are always have to be together. And I just love that the JCPA is really, really focusing in that way. And you know, one of the other pieces that you didn't mention, but which is also completely true here, is that books that feature Jewish characters or are written by Jewish authors, as well as Muslim characters and Muslim authors or Sikh characters. These are books that are often taken off the shelves because they somehow make people uncomfortable. And so like it's also like faith communities are at risk here too. And it's really, you know, one of the frames that Interfaith Alliance has worked on for years is like, how does religious liberty, religious freedom really work for everyone? That isn't just an excuse for bigotry. And I just really, you know, I think it's important, you know, that we also mention, and you've been really open on this show, that you have a transgender son. And so like, you know, books that allow your son to feel seen, allow your son to feel a part of the story of a local community, the story of the America that is today, the story of the world. Those are life-saving, life-giving stories. And so this is also deeply personal, you know, isn't it?
It is on every single level that you just said. Anytime people are uncomfortable with a book because it doesn't reflect them, then it's a silencing of anyone who is different. And fundamentally, we're all different. And that's the beauty that we have in this country. That's the ethos that I think both of our organizations are working off of. That's the strength that we can really bring. And so we have absolutely seen that books about the Holocaust have been pulled out of libraries and off of shelves, which is especially terrifying when we know that so much of the ways in which the Holocaust was enabled and began was with the burning of books.
100%.
And so we can keep on unpacking it for every one of these things, but that's what literature does. Literature opens you up to ideas that are outside of your experience. And that's what we need right now at a time where people are turning insular, or where we have people who are invested in sowing fear and distrust. The notion that you could get into somebody else's family dinner through a book, or you can walk the streets in someone else's body through a book, is so incredibly powerful. And that's why it scares people. That's exactly why. And so let's not be shy about saying that the people who are invested in taking these books off of the shelves have a very specific agenda. They don't want kids to know that there are identities that are different. They don't want people to know that there are people who change their gender. They don't want people to know that you can be a moral, loving person of faith who does not have a Christian faith. All of these are things that there are people invested in quashing.
Yeah.
And so we need to be actively speaking about it and fighting against it, because if our kids aren't learning how to do this at the youngest ages, and if we're not giving them access to the widest world possible, then we're only limiting the experiences that they could have, and we're making it so that our society can't be the welcoming, beautiful, rich society that we know it is.
100%. I mean, it's stunting the imagination. It's like stifling the opportunity for empathy. You know, I mean, it's a very harmful. And you know, as you know, a family with two dads, like for my kids, just to come across a book casually that has two dads. They don't need to say, look, this is the best way to be. I'm so glad that now everybody is going to just have two dads or two moms or whatever. That's not, there's no agenda behind it aside from normalizing it. You know, I mean, just like making it a part of, that's another story. It's another story. It does not attack anybody else's story. It just allows people to be open to the fact that there's lots of different ways to live. It's actually a very beautiful, I love the way you're framing it because this is like, it's an opportunity for beauty, for engagement, for creativity, for love. And that's, I think, one of the things that's so important for religious communities to show up in this moment. It's not just that we oppose censorship and we oppose book bans, but we actually celebrate reading. We celebrate literature. We celebrate the opportunity to learn and grow and be with one another in all of our differences.
That's exactly it. And I think you said it so well. And I think we need to keep on emphasizing the point that it's that normalization that is exactly what scares the people
Right.
who are leading these efforts.
100%.
They don't want their kids to live in a world in which you can have two dads. And that should terrify all of us, because if people get to decide what world their kids get to live in, and they can decide that's a world without two dads, it also can be a world without Muslim people, or a world without Jewish people, or a world without fill in the blank of whatever idea
Right.
it is that's just different. And that's why it's a fundamental element of undermining democracy, because if the goal is to create a country in which we only have one idea, that is fundamentally undemocratic.
It's fundamentally undemocratic. And, you know, honestly, we can go into it. You know, I mean, like the idea of like, it's a Christian nationalist playbook. I mean, it's really like, it's so like this idea that there's one way to be and there's one, you know, one religion, one way. It's very dangerous. I would love, you know, you're coming from a position as a rabbi and someone who's really been trained in the Jewish faith tradition. What is a story or scripture? Or is there anything you can point to within the Jewish tradition that can, you know, give us courage or empower us in this moment? I mean, there's so many great stories. And again, we're all about stories. So is there anything that you all are turning to specifically in this effort that says like, that's why this is a Jewish issue?
You know, what I keep coming back to is not a specific story, but actually an entire corpus, which is that when the oral tradition was being developed at the turn of the millennium, and the oral tradition ultimately gets written down in the 2nd century in the form of the Mishnah, and then later in the 5th century in the form of the Gemara. But when it gets written down, when somebody realized that the community was in danger of being lost, and so they had to write down a tradition that had never been written down, they wrote down this huge corpus of wisdom. But then there's supplemental texts in which there's what made it into the book, and then they wrote all the things that didn't make it into the book. So just because there was a winning opinion, and even the book itself includes a multitude of debates and opinions, there's still also the supplemental text of, here are all the things that we still don't want to lose, even though it didn't ultimately make it into the book. We need to preserve ideas. Ideas are their currency, their richness, their power, they're who we are, and they're the foundation that we stand on. And when we start cutting them out, we lose everything of who we are.
Oh my God. I don't know if that qualifies as Devar Torah, but it was certainly a beautiful teaching. That is so good. I have never heard it framed like that. I feel like, God, that's great. And so what we're really talking about is like, you know, the book that was official is the Torah, right? And then there's the surrounding, you know, opinions that didn't make it in. What are they called?
So the core text that we're talking about is the Talmud, which is what we'd call the
Talmud.
oral Torah.
Okay. Yeah.
Different from so we have the written Torah and then we have the oral Torah, which is now
Okay.
also written down. So the Talmud. So we're talking
Yeah.
about the Talmud, which is really, I mean, the whole basis of rabbinic Judaism that modern Judaism is based on, just centuries and centuries of debate and learning.
What was the addition? I mean, because there's all this surrounding text that people also study, which I think is so great, which is like, and on the other side of the issue, I mean, it's just, but it helps us keep memory of the live arguments, debates. It's really important. What, is there a name for that?
So the specific text I was talking about is the Tosefta, which is the addendum to the Mishnah. But there's centuries of that in which it keeps on getting preserved, in which ideas continue to be written down, even when they're not the prevailing view. People who, as they're writing their own ideas, quote from the people that they're disagreeing with. And what it says to us also is that an idea that is different from your own, it's not dangerous. What it actually does is it might help you fine-tune your own views. Seeing a life that's different from mine might help me to reaffirm who I am, not because I disrespect that other life, but because it gives me a frame of reference to know who I am internally for me. And so we're not scared of those. We should never be scared of those. We should use those to strengthen ourselves.
I love this, and that's such a strong argument as we think about this National Day of Action against book bans and against censorship. This idea that all information can be good, and that we shouldn't lose it. We shouldn't be censoring it just because it may not work for us in this moment. Doesn't mean that it won't have value, and it does not have to be dangerous to us. And I just think that's such a great rallying cry for this moment. Last question: what would you recommend that local synagogues do to show up for their local libraries, librarians, school libraries? What are tangible ways that religious leaders and religious communities can make sure that the local library doesn't feel totally under siege?
There's so much that can be done right now. It's hard to know because it's different in every community, but people should be reaching out to your local libraries, to your school libraries. Ask them first and foremost what they need. In some states, there's legislation that's happening statewide that we need people speaking out against. But these are also things that are coming up potentially at city councils or county councils. Sometimes there's smaller library boards. Many of these are positions that are either elected or appointed by elected officials, but most of us aren't paying attention to. Right. Find out how your library is run. Find out when their meetings are. Show up at the meetings. Make sure that your voice is being heard. Same for school libraries. This is being decided at the school board level. And so go to the school boards, speak to people. If you have the time, run for the school board or the library board. We need good people who are doing this, and we need people who are speaking out. The other thing I will say, though, is that some of these books that are being pulled are not being pulled because people are being told to, but because of the fear, because there's so much rhetoric around this, and people are proactively pulling books off the shelves because they don't want to get the angry phone call from a parent, or they don't want to then get potentially penalized by the school board later. And so we need loud voices who are also on the other side. And so find out if books have been pulled from libraries and ask the librarians for them. Make sure that there are people who are saying, we value these books, we want these books, we want to support these books. But I will say librarians are probably on the front lines of this fight. Ask your librarian what you can do and show them some love because they are getting beaten down in this and they could use all the support they could get.
Rabba Rori Picker Neiss is Senior Vice President for Community Relations at Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She's also clearly an effective leader fighting book bans and censorship, which far too often target already marginalized groups in our country. Rori, thank you so much for being with us once again on The State of Belief. I value your wisdom so much.
Thank you, and so great to talk to you as always.
October 19th is the annual Freedom to Read Day of Action, but the work continues all year long. You can find information about Unite Against Book Bans and the work of all of our guests at stateofbelief.com or uniteagainstbookbans.org. Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making the State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. Be sure to join us next week when we talk to leaders who are on buses or making tours all across the country looking at the state of faith and our democracy. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.